Chapter 13. The Climate of Fear. From Disgrace by J. M. Coetzee. Scapegoating worked in practice while it still had religious powers behind it. You loaded the sins of the city onto the goat's back and drove it out, and the city was cleansed. It worked because everyone knew how to read the ritual, including the gods. Then the gods died, and all of a sudden you had to cleanse the city without divine help. Real actions were demanded instead of symbolism. The censor was born, in the Roman sense. Watchfulness became the watchword, the watchfulness of all over all. Purgation was replaced by the purge. The scapegoat is an ancient religious and ritualistic practice and, these days, a metaphor for social exclusion. In the Bible, the scapegoat was one of two kid goats. One would be sacrificed, and the living one, the scapegoat, was sent into the wilderness, symbolically carrying sins and impurities with it. Scapegoating is not just to be found in the Bible though, it is one of the enduring human archetypes found across cultures and times. The ancient Greeks practiced scapegoating rituals during extraordinary circumstances such as famine, drought, or plague, in order to save the whole community. While the Israelites and the Hittites used animals, the ancient Greeks used humans. Being civilized does not necessarily mean being more humane. Death was not essential, but expulsion from the community was key, one way or another. The scapegoat might be banished, or stoned or burned to death. There is a comparison with the hysterical, burning times, during the centuries when witches were tried and executed, accused of all the sins and troubles of their communities. Who is scapegoated in the time of COVID and who are the high priests and inquisitors? We might like to believe we are above such superstitious and archaic behavior, but where is the evidence that human beings have changed? In fact, can we observe the early warning behavioral signs and symbols of a nascent religion? It looks like the NHS co-opted the rainbow from the Pride movement, but it's also an ancient religious symbol, integral to the Bible's flood story, and in Greco-Roman mythology it was a path between earth and heaven. Fans of the Avengers films will remember the rainbow bifrost, which links Midgard and Asgard. Rainbows in windows ostensibly honor the NHS and its workers, but, because they represent our health service, perhaps at an unconscious level they also serve a talismanic role in warding away disease and bad luck, just like other amulets and home adornments such as the hamsa, the green man, the nazar, a lucky horseshoe, or the Romans' flying pottery penises. There is mixed evidence that community mask wearing protects us from viruses, but we wear masks anyway, as the vestiture of the faithful and the obedient. Hand sanitizing baptizes us daily into the new religion of health and safetyism. As valued government advises, the priest caste has been replaced by a scientist caste. Churches closed their doors at the behest of modelers and behavioral scientists with scarcely a murmur of resistance. Vaccines are modern medical miracles, but they also evoke a modern biosecurity incarnation of transubstantiation, especially when delivered in cathedrals with organ music playing, in an intersection of the old religion and the new religion. In this new creed, what is to be done with the impious and the heretics? As always, they are scapegoated. As Coetzee wrote in Disgrace, in modern times scapegoating has transmogrified into censorship. There is a discernible blend of scapegoating and censorship among the self-appointed keepers of truth during the COVID epidemic. These days, no one is to be burnt at the stake or ritually sacrificed, just metaphorically cast into a desert, professionally shamed, no platformed, unpublished, removed from the modern-day public fora of Twitter and YouTube. Silenced and banished. In this way the scapegoat can take on the sins of society, as well as serve as a warning to other potential dissenters. Speak up, and you are next. The media, big tech social media giants, politicians, scientists and perhaps all of us, the mob, have enforced a climate of fear through scapegoating. MP Neil O'Brien appointed himself inquisitor of COVID skeptics. Alongside other volunteers, he created a fact-checking website as well as regularly denouncing dissenters in Twitter threads. He was praised for his efforts by fellow MP Jacob Rees-Mogg, who said he was doing a fantastic job, leading some to believe that O'Brien was acting unofficially on the government's behalf. The website contained lists of people as well as general claims that he deemed wrong and misleading. Some saw this as an important service in combating disinformation, such as Rees-Mogg. Some were troubled that an MP, both a public servant and someone holding a position of authority, created lists of British citizens in order to pillory them and digitally cast them out. The lists are also one-sided. They only include people who have made mistakes that go against the government narrative. The government, its ministers and sage advisors have also made mistakes during the epidemic, but they are not included on the lists. A one-sided presentation of mistakes betrays the intention to silence particular voices and views. Mistakes will be made, and they should be accounted for. We all make mistakes. The danger is when mistakes are weaponized to intimidate and stifle debate. The website Antivirus, the COVID-19 FAQ, may even make mistakes of its own. After all, how can all the COVID science be definitely settled? How can the website creators be confident that they arbitrate the absolute truth? One of the refutations caught my eye. The website asserts that suicide rates have not risen during lockdowns, either in the UK or worldwide. A report from the University of Manchester looked at real-time surveillance and claimed there was no evidence of a rise of post-lockdown suicides. As I explained in Chapter 11, Counting the Dead, it is too soon to be certain about UK suicides, and I expect the same is true internationally. Neil O'Brien's Twitter attacks felt dogged and personal. Journalists with strong personalities were better able to weather the slings and arrows. The distinguished scientists were probably more discomfited by their placement on the lists, including two from the UK's Oxford University, Professor Sunetra Gupta, a highly regarded professor of theoretical epidemiology, and Dr. Carl Heenahan, a GP, clinical epidemiologist and a fellow of Kellogg College, the director of the University of Oxford's Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine and editor-in-chief of BMJ Evidence-Based Medicine. Dr. Claire Craig, a diagnostic pathologist, also came under fire for asking controversial questions about the PCR testing. She described the attacks by O'Brien as bullying, and responded on Twitter, "Almost none of Neil O'Brien's tweets about me offered evidence to prove me wrong. I believe his intention is to deter me and other people from speaking out. I am concerned that a government representative would behave this way about good faith scientific discussion. Public execration has a silencing effect. When dissent is framed as mistaken, irresponsible and dangerous, it creates serious personal, public and professional consequences for the individuals and beyond. Speaking out during the epidemic felt akin to questioning the church, rather than contributing to an ongoing scientific debate or discussing the political decisions made in a democracy. That is not a healthy situation for journalism, science or public debate. Democracy requires a free press and free speech. But is scapegoating simply driven by individuals, such as O'Brien, or do we have to accept something about human nature? It might be a natural human tendency to scapegoat from a position of assumed moral high ground. A study, Moralization of COVID-19 Health Response, Asymmetry and Tolerance for Human Costs, found that during COVID, health-minded approaches have been moralized, even to the point of a sacred value, and that, merely questioning sacred values led to moral cleansing. Defending lockdowns and restrictions was seen as moral, and questioning them seen as immoral. As a consequence, the human costs of the restrictions were under-acknowledged, deprioritized and granted less moral weight. The report warned this could lead to deaths of despair among those human costs. As we have seen, proponents of lockdowns might wish, even unconsciously, to underplay these in order to remain comfortable on the moral high ground. The Behavioral Government series by the Behavioral Insights team talked about how we reject ideas from another group, even if they are good ideas. If another party does not think the same way, then our preferred reaction is not to reassess our own opinions. Instead, we try to come up with ways of denigrating the opposition. This happens because we find it hard to maintain both a positive image of ourselves and a positive image of someone who disagrees with us. We decide that those who think differently are biased, through ideology, self-interest, malice or stubbornness. While we have considered the issue carefully, they are just proceeding from dogma. This perception of bias makes conflict and division escalate further. This process happens most clearly between competing interest groups, where it has been called the devil shift, seeing your opponents as more extreme and more evil than they actually are. This goes some way towards explaining the viciousness towards opposite views in the COVID epidemic. Someone can happily justify the inquisitor status when the devil shift has occurred. You would think that, as this explanation emanated from behavioral scientists embedded in government, the government would learn from it, rather than permit or encourage an MP to denigrate people with opposing views. This perspective from BIT could also explain why people on the left did not oppose lockdown even though it disproportionately harmed the poor and vulnerable, because they did not think it was possible that they could share the same perspective as those on the right, or libertarian, side. Oppositional group thinking creates tribalism and closes minds to different points of view. Response to lockdown was hyper-partisan. People who questioned the use of lockdown were sometimes labeled lockdown skeptics. Being skeptical can be seen as a positive attribute, which is probably why the terminology shifted to COVID denier. This reframing made people seem silly rather than skeptical, as though they denied the existence of the virus, rather than questioned public health policies. The word denier conjures the callousness of Holocaust deniers. Anyone with any concern or question could be given the umbrella term denier. Who on earth wants to be on that team? Another label was conspiracy theorist, which again no one wants to be called. Some conspiracy theory predictions actually came to pass, but more on that in Chapter 14, Cults, Conspiracy and Psychic Epidemics. People with concerns about the vaccines were anti-vax. One study labeled people who didn't want to wear masks psychopaths. All these labels contribute to a climate of fear which makes people timid about expressing their opinions. These reports chimed with the on-the-ground views of Professor Ellen Townsend of Nottingham University, a psychologist and specialist in suicide and self-harm, who told me that the culture of suppression and scapegoating of dissenting academic voices in this crisis has been dreadful. Leading experts have been cast as outliers by those in power because their theories and evidence do not fit the official COVID narrative. She was also alert to the personal costs, telling me that there were people who might never speak to her again, but she also received emails from people thanking her for speaking up. Townsend and fellow academics set up ReachWell, a group which focuses on the impacts of lockdown and restrictions on young people, because the refusal to name and account for the harms of restrictions is one of the biggest scientific errors of all time, especially in relation to children and the disadvantaged. She told me she had been very concerned about the exploitation of a fear campaign to raise the sense of threat and imminent danger of death, which had left people frightened and bewildered. I came across Professor Townsend on Twitter. Sadly, during the epidemic she decided to withdraw from the platform. I've always had a love-hate relationship with Twitter, but during the dark days of 2020-21, I witnessed reprehensible behavior by some academics, she told me. People who I previously admired have behaved in dreadful ways and said absolutely vicious things about other academics that were completely unwarranted. Science, or at least scientific debate, has died in these times. I decided to leave the toxicity of Twitter and focus my energies on other ways of communicating that permit dialogue and nuance. Two more psychologists, Dr. Gary Sidley and Dr. Harry Bunker-Smith, wrote to the British Psychological Society in December 2020 regarding their concerns about the ethics of the government's use of covert behavioral psychology. Sidley said that it was hard to get co-signatories to the letter because many psychologists working in the NHS are twitch. Why about their jobs, and the ones in the private sector are nervous because they interact with the NHS. The brainwashing has been so effective that I can understand it. Being in a minority is uncomfortable. Bunker-Smith, a co-author of the letter, had experienced this discomfort. She said, it felt incredibly risky to question the data and the measures when she posted on a clinical psychology forum about her ethical concerns. The post had a lot of likes and she received personal messages from people who said they were too scared to like her post or comment. But there were some challenging replies, and some people were very aggressive, considering it was a professional forum. She was called a conspiracy theorist and accused of not caring about the people who died of COVID. No one wants to be seen as uncaring, and these public accusations inhibit professional debate. People told me about personal stories, people they knew who died of COVID, she said, and I was told I should join COVID frontline support groups to understand the PTSD they feel. This became very black and white. Psychologists should be able to sit in the grey. She has been told she should be struck off from the Health and Care Professions Council and felt she had to be willing to lose her career just to raise questions. Sidley had hoped more psychologists would be shocked and angry about the policies around lockdown, masks and restrictions that have caused distress to people, but had been in a minority. He expected more to care about the mental health impact. While he thought some would like to speak out about the behavioral science techniques but they are nervous about putting their head above the parapet, he also thought some think the world might be better after all this for some reason, because they are socialist or worried about the environment, and yet more were driven by their own fear of death. Echoing SPI1 in a previous chapter, he believes psychologists are particularly prone to being more neurotic. On 23 March 2021, Sidley received a reply from Dr. Roger Paxton, the chair of BPS's Ethics Committee, to his letter. It said that although he had intended to raise the ethical concerns voiced in Sidley's letter at their Ethics Committee meeting in March, the agenda was too full. He promised to raise the concerns at the next meeting in June. We must deduce that the BPS didn't find the ethical considerations of fear messaging to be troubling or pressing. Dr. Knut Witkowski, former head of biostatistics, epidemiology and research design at Rockefeller University, also experienced troubles online. He was fiercely critical of lockdown measures in an interview on YouTube in the spring of 2020, which garnered nearly 1.5 million views before being removed. The only explanation for its removal was that it violated community standards. Susan Wojcicki, CEO of YouTube, warned that the platform would remove any information about the virus it regarded as problematic. Anything that would go against World Health Organization recommendations would be a violation of our policy. Witkowski seemed bemused when I asked him about the reaction to his views. He told me, "The reaction generally is good. I don't come across as somebody who has weird conspiracy theories. I base what I say on data." I remembered my own reaction to his views. Back in the early, innocent days of the epidemic when I was vacuuming up as much virus information as possible online, I found Witkowski. His credentials, experience and views about COVID were interesting and reassuring. Maybe I gravitated to the reassurance at a time when others were feeling panicked, but I liked his interview on YouTube. I remember one of his central points was that there was no reason to believe COVID would be significantly different to all the other respiratory diseases the world had ever known. Extremist views of the pandemic rose to the top of public consciousness, pushed by the media's helping hands, while his brand of perspective and rationale sank and was drowned by arbitrary censorship decisions. This wasn't the first time Witkowski had been opposed to a fear-mongering constellation of journalists, politicians and doctors, as he put it. He recalled that during the AIDS scare, they said children would be infected by toys. That was one of the images they used to scare people. At that time I stood up and said, correct as it turned out, that it would never spread among Caucasian German heterosexuals. And it did not, of course. He perceives a similar program of fear in play around COVID, which he said is actually not the end of the world. Witkowski had an interesting take on why the video was removed. He said that people were commenting and he was engaging with them in the comments under the video. Interaction is not currently wanted, he observed, and that may be another reason YouTube took it down. If people interact, they start forming their own opinions. I wondered what he thought the solution to this censorship was, and he identified the scope of the problem more broadly. Firstly, the scale of fear, and secondly, the loss of independent science. He told me that in his view, politicians and media are spreading fear. It goes far beyond what the situation would justify. The media makes money by selling fear. People buy fear. They listen, they get emotional, they spend more time looking at commercials. For more than 20 years I read the New York Times every morning. Then I cancelled it. I couldn't stand it anymore. It used to separate reporting and opinion. Not anymore. The front page says the numbers are surging. That is an opinion. If they said increasing, that would be reporting. What was Witkowski afraid of? My fear was that one evening I couldn't go and have dinner anymore. But more seriously, giving the government information about who is meeting whom and for how long, tracking us. It is becoming dangerously close to 1984. And like in 1984, it is fear which keeps people in a state where they follow the government. It's not Oceania and Eurasia anymore, it's COVID. It doesn't matter what the fear is. If there is fear, you can control the people. Of course, I agreed that the media had, regrettably, peddled fear, and the government might be exploiting it. I was keen to know what he meant about the loss of independence in science. He told me the main problem is the way science is funded. When I started my career at university, you were fully funded with a salary from the university. People had independence. That is now gone. Virtually all scientists in the field of epidemiology and medicine have university positions where they get a desk and access to a library. In the US, the funding comes from the NIH, National Institutes of Health. You don't want to bite the hand that feeds you. I asked how he was able to speak up, and he told me, the people who have spoken up are retired and so they have independence, but that when he was at Rockefeller University, he would not have dared to say what I did, or I would have compromised the funding. I asked how he thought some of the leading voices in the pandemic might have been influenced. I was specifically interested in Neil Ferguson, whose modeling was considered partially responsible for triggering lockdowns. He didn't take the question too seriously because, among scientists, Neil Ferguson does not have any credibility because his predictions are always wrong. Another scientist who experienced the glare of a controversial public reaction was Henrik Ullum. He was one of the researchers and authors of the Dan-mask study effectiveness of adding a mask recommendation to other public health measures to prevent SARS-CoV-2 infection in Danish mask wearers. At the time of the presidential election, Ullum wrote a tweet saying that the researchers were sorry that the publication of the study was delayed, and people inferred that the delay was political. He told me, "A lot of people in Denmark and on social media were pissed that we wouldn't release the data. People thought we were influencing the presidential election." As one of Denmark's social public health scientists, his inbox is always full. He told me that in one day he received 3 emails which exemplified the reaction to him. One person emailed me asking me to lock the country down and make young people behave well. One person asked me not to be the mouthpiece of the press. Another person accused me of being on an axis of evil with Bill Gates and the Danish Prime Minister. That's 3 emails in one day from one interview on Danish radio. As he said, he has received fear and madness in all directions during the COVID epidemic. So, what was so controversial about the mask study? Masks have been mandated around the world despite very little evidence that they are effective. The study was designed to investigate whether the mask wearer was protected. According to Henrik, the results were weak and insignificant and not conclusive. In both the write-up of the study and in talking with me on the phone, Ullum was careful to say that he didn't want the data to disturb public health policy. In fact, since the very muted publication of the study, Ullum has been appointed director of the Statens Serum Institute, the Danish equivalent of Public Health England. I presume that it wouldn't do, in his position, to publicly undermine his country's mask laws. I asked Ullum why the study did take so long to be published, given that masks were such a controversial and unevidenced imposition on people around the world. He was evasive. "Your guess is as good as mine. Maybe it's just not the done thing for scientists to criticize the publications which publish them. You don't want to bite the hand that feeds your future credibility. Maybe there's an embarrassment that the study didn't produce the positive results the team were looking for." Ullum was so keen not to blame the publications he even suggested that maybe they thought the science is not good enough. Really? His science wasn't good enough? But it was peer-reviewed and published. He qualified. "If you look at the confidence limit of our results, they were quite wide. No statistical difference means there could be major effects hidden because the sample size is not big enough." I asked outright if the difficulty in finding a publication was, in fact, political. Was the study a hot potato? No. He said, "There was tension about masks, but I don't think it was politically motivated." He did concede that, "The editors don't want their publication to upset the handling of an epidemic on a global scale. Almost all health authorities are promoting mask wearing. We don't want our paper to disturb that." There was no evidence to support not wearing masks. There was slight data in favor of mask wearing. As a researcher, I also don't want our data to disturb public health policy. I asked if the delays, the controversy and criticism from both sides of the mask debate would be bad for science. Would it put scientists off taking risks? "I've been a researcher for 30 years and I have not experienced anything like it," Ullum said. "This experience was because COVID is so high on our political agenda at the moment. We'll go back to normal. Vaccines and warm weather in the spring will bring normality." I agreed that I hoped normality would return in the spring, after a long year. I wondered what he thought of the level of fear people feel about COVID, and he said, "We haven't managed the fear well enough. There has been too much fear. This is a serious epidemic, and we need to do the right things, but it's not an apocalypse." Censorship was evident across science, journalism and politics. Lucy Easthope is used to being seen as a wild card in government advisory meetings. She told me the UK didn't follow existing science and pandemic planning during the COVID epidemic. Lockdown went against previous protocol and there was a cost to that. Lockdown is now ingrained deeply into our psyche. People made choices to not see loved ones. They made decisions they have to live with. It's going to be very difficult to admit it was a mistake. I asked if she thinks people will be able to admit mistakes, or see there were other paths to follow. They will fight us like weasels in a bag. Part of the fight is preemptive censorship. I talked about the inhibiting effects of Ofcom's guidelines in Chapter 2, Fear spreads in the media like an airborne virus. The big tech platforms also developed policies designed to counter disinformation. We saw interviews with established scientists removed from YouTube, and articles published on Facebook from sources as respected as The Spectator and Unheard were flagged as containing potentially false information for including the wrong views from the wrong people, where wrong means counter to government or WHO advice. A video interview with Professor Carol Sikora, a world-leading oncology expert and a former chief of the cancer program of the WHO, was removed from Facebook for violating guidelines. An article by Professor Carl Heenahan about the landmark Danish mask RCT was labeled as containing false information on Facebook. Google appeared to shadow ban, whereby the search results are suppressed, the Great Barrington Declaration, a website and letter written by respected scientists recommending an approach called focused protection, in opposition to many countries' policies of lockdown. Google claimed this was not deliberate, but people were suspicious that the effect was seemingly switched on and then off after there was a fuss. In traditional media, journalists mocked and discredited the wrong scientists. Professor Sikora's positive and balanced views were described as dangerous in The Guardian. The Guardian had particular form for criticizing dissenting scientists, also describing the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration as creating a rift which was a dangerous distraction. The devil shift was seen all the more clearly through the metaphors used by Paul Mason, who wrote in The New Statesman that, like Dante's Inferno, COVID denialism is structured in concentric circles, and said the innermost circle of hell is reserved for prominent lockdown skeptics such as Toby Young, Alison Pearson, Lawrence Fox, Julia Hartley-Brewer and Peter Hitchens. All bar one are journalists. Specifically, in Mason's view, a bunch of rich, well-connected conservative journalists and their views are dangerous. The intergroup opposition between left-wing and right-wing journalists seems to have obscured from Mason that all have voiced concerns about the impact of lockdown on the disadvantaged. And so, journalists seek to stifle not just scientists, but also other journalists. Opposite and different views were described as dangerous so many times. In the course of researching this book I was told variously that I was probably under surveillance, that I might not be published again, that I should do a Freedom of Information request to see if there was a file on me because I'd put so many awkward questions into the government. Incidentally, I never got a reply to that FOI, and that there would probably be a campaign to smear and discredit me before the book was published. So, if any unpleasant rumors emerge, don't necessarily believe them. The COVID epidemic has produced scapegoating on a mass scale. Professionals and academics were cast out of approving professional circles. But were we all scapegoated in some way? The government imposed many restrictions on the population to control the spread of COVID and used fear, among other tactics, to encourage compliance. Yet one of the chief ways people caught COVID was in hospitals, which is beyond the responsibility of the population. A SAGE paper claimed that a staggering 40.5% of COVID infections in the first wave were caught in hospital. Between the beginning of the second wave in September 2020 and the 13th of January 2021, over 25,000 people caught COVID while in hospital, but this may be an underestimate due to the limitations of the data available. The NHS was resolutely tight-lipped about hospital-acquired infections. Many people would have been discharged before receiving a diagnosis. I anecdotally heard of a number through interviews with nurses and doctors, who would then have spread COVID among their families and the community. We don't know the scale of nosocomial and the respective secondary infections, but the NHS's withholding of the data most likely speaks to the volume of it. In January 2021, Keir Starmer called for tougher measures including the closure of zoos. All the animals in the zoos, the visitors, the staff, the very notion of fun itself, were scapegoated while hospital-acquired infections were ignored, to save the hallowed NHS from being criticised. Of course, if you believe that legally mandated restrictions and lockdowns are the way to go, you might as well throw in zoos. I'm not making a special point about them, except that the idea they are a big problem is farcical. But still, none of this addresses hospital-acquired infections, about which we heard very little from the Minister of Health, NHS spokespeople, or the media. Nosocomial infections are higher when community prevalence is higher, probably because of increased traffic in hospitals, so lockdowns do make some sense in helping to suppress hospital-acquired infections. But otherwise, creating fear in the population and locking everyone down did nothing about the problem of nosocomial infection. There also wasn't enough PPE, personal protective equipment, at the outset of the epidemic. Did we all have to carry the sins of an inadequately prepared government and ill-equipped NHS? Instead of being cast out into the desert, did our scapegoating take the form of restrictions and confinement? The ultimate scapegoats in the COVID epidemic and lockdown might have been children and the young. As Ellen Townsend told me, their needs were subjugated. The legacy that we are creating for the young people of this country is horrendous. There are austere times ahead for them. They lived through a time when they were virtually ignored. In all actions, people in power should be doing things for the benefit of children. Why are we not putting them first in everything? Scapegoating is an enduring human practice. Imagine trying to explain to the Mayans they did not need to throw live children to their watery graves in cenotes in order to ensure the rain fell. Perhaps our children were COVID's sacrificial lambs.